Glib Audiostories presents The Psychic, Episode 5, The Revelites, by Silas Scott and Pinkleet. Trigger warning for descriptions of religious abuse, physical abuse, and psychological abuse. Chapter 1. Elizabeth Byrne. Abraham couldn't believe what he'd found out. Yes, his wife had been disappearing from the house weekly for the past 3.5 years, and, more recently, church. And yes, this had often worried him, but he would have never in a million years thought that she had been seeing another man. She was the pastor's daughter, for gosh sake. The notion seemed so ridiculous to him. He thought she loved him. And dang it, Lizzie, we have a child together, he spat, though he was trying to keep his voice on the quieter side, for said child was supposed to be asleep in the next room. It's not what you think, she insisted, voice quiet as ever. He's just a friend. A friend, Abraham spat, from outside the religion. Bad company ruins good morals. That's from 1 Corinthians 15:33. He's an outsider, Lizzie. He's going to lead you astray. He sighed, then, seeming almost resigned, tired, "We'll tell the pastor in the morning." Elizabeth's heart sank. The pastor, her father, a cruel man. She hadn't been beat by him since having Rob, mostly because she didn't go to him with her problems anymore, but the fear of him never left. "Abe," she said weakly, "please, he doesn't need to know." "Well, what do you want me to do, Liz? Ignore the fact that you've been running off with another man after, may I remind you, having my child?" "Abe, it's not like that. I promise. Please, I don't need—" "You don't need help?" "I don't need his help." Abraham's voice turned to a low growl. "Elizabeth, I am not fighting with you. The pastor is a man of the Lord, and your spirit is in danger. As much as I am angry with you, I still love you, and I cannot let you be condemned to hell." Elizabeth stared at the ground. "If you loved me, you wouldn't take me to him." Abraham looked up and clasped his hands, clearly praying for guidance, before turning back to look at Lizzie. "Go to bed. We'll talk to the pastor in the morning. End of subject." The next morning, Abraham got Rob dressed, after making Elizabeth very aware that he did not want her alone with him given the circumstances. Lizzie understood his concerns, but that didn't mean they didn't hurt. The little family walked up to the church, the 2-year-old's hand in his father's as he toddled alongside. He was a little off balance due to having been delayed in his walking up until he was 1.5 years, and he couldn't talk at all yet. The boy jumped over a puddle and grunted as he hit the ground, but was tugged back to his father's side roughly. "Don't," Abraham said gruffly. "You'll fall." But Elizabeth was smiling at Rob, though the expression was weak. "He's just having a little fun." Abraham shook his head. "You let him get away with anything. That's probably why he's so delayed." The woman's expression turned sad. "About that, do you think we should, I don't know, see a doctor?" "He's not retarded, Lizzie." Abraham spat, clearly offended by the notion. "No, I mean, Henry said—" "Oh no, don't you dare start bringing up that man." She went quiet. Rob was blinking up at them, his head tilted slightly. Elizabeth sent the boy a weak smile, but Abraham pulled him roughly again, this time out of her line of sight. Elizabeth stared at the ground, trying to catch her breath as they walked through the church doors. They would enter the modern but ornate church building. Lizzie would see her family sitting in the front pew, her mother and younger brother's head bowed as they looked in the Bible. Her other brother, Elijah, would be sitting next to them, sitting with his heavily pregnant wife, Mary. She would be softly talking to him. Elizabeth stood, frozen, as she glanced up at them, so Abraham pulled her by the arm. "Good morning, Mrs. Payne." Abe nodded to the older woman, then to the younger. "Sister Mary?" "Brother Abraham," Mary would say, smiling, the picture of a perfect church wife. Delilah would look up and smile. "Hello, Abraham, Elizabeth," she would say. Gideon would look over, the dark circles around his eyes. He would be slouched over, silent as he watched the interaction. "Hi, Gideon," Elizabeth almost whispered, wanting him to have some sort of acknowledgement. Rob looked over to Gideon, tilting his head, always so curious. He hummed out a note, almost as if thinking, and Abe nudged him to be quiet. Abe turned to Delilah. "Is your husband in his office? We need to talk to him a moment." "Yes, he is preparing for the sermon," Delilah would say, nodding, her brows furrowing. "Did Rob do something?" Abraham shook his head. "No. Would you mind watching him while I take Lizzie in to see her father?" Delilah's eyes would lock on her daughter, as did everyone else's, a silent judgment passing over her. Gideon would move to take Rob's hand and sit the boy next to him, his head bent low. "Of course we will," Mary would say, breaking the silence. Rob stretched his hand out flat as it was grabbed. He never liked his hand being held. He swung his feet as he sat in the pew, watching them. Then he turned to watch Gideon. The older boy interested him immensely, so he stared. Elizabeth's eyes focused on the ground as she tried desperately to focus on something other than all eyes being on her. Abraham took his wife by the hand and led her to the pastor's office. He knocked. Lizzie did not look up. "Come in," Pastor Payne's voice would call out from behind the door. Abraham opened the door. Still Lizzie did not look up. "Good morning, Pastor Payne," Abraham said. Her breathing quickened. Reuben Payne would be standing behind his desk, wearing the official pastor robes. "Good morning," he would say, his eyes looking between the couple. "What troubles you, my children?" "I'm afraid," Abraham sighed, "my Lizzie has sinned." The pastor would let a moment of silence pass, his eyes turning to regard his daughter, then Abe. "In what way?" "She lied," he said plainly, "about where she's been." Elizabeth caved in on herself more, as her breast became shallow and turned to sobs. She knew that wasn't entirely true. She had said she was out with friends, which was the truth, but she knew protesting would likely only make things worse. "She was with an outsider. She's been abandoning our family for a male outsider. I fear she is becoming precariously close to adultery." Elizabeth felt her knees weaken, and she became unsteady on her feet. Why was he making this sound so much worse than it was? Did he want her father to lose control? "Who?" Pastor Payne asked, his gaze turning to Elizabeth as he waited for her to answer him. Elizabeth stayed quiet, fearful. She wanted to run away, but knew her husband would surely stop her. Abraham backed up to the pastor angrily. "Tell him." She looked away from the men. "His name's Henry." The pastor would walk around from the table up to Elizabeth. He'd place a hand under her chin, his thumb just under her mouth. "Who?" he would ask again, waiting for a full name. Her face crumpled as he touched her, and she winced. I can't." The man would scowl, his grip tightening. "The lips of the righteous know what finds favor, but the mouth of the wicked only what is perverse. Proverbs 10:32. You will tell me, Elizabeth." Her jaw tightened, and she grabbed his wrist. "He's a police officer," she said suddenly. "If you hurt me, I am done keeping secrets." Reuben would pull his hand back, quickly slapping her hard across the face. "I dare you," he would snarl. "Tell me his name, or he will suffer more." She fell to her knees, holding her face. Abraham just watched her quietly. "Just," she sobbed, "please, don't hurt him." "Abraham, you did good," the pastor would say. "You may go back to the pews now. I need to speak to my daughter. Alone." "Thank you." Abraham nodded, walking back outside, closing the door behind him. Hearing the door click, Elizabeth whimpered and curled into a tight ball, still on her knees. The pastor looked down at Elizabeth, letting her sit there in silence. "3 times," he said, holding up 3 fingers, his voice low. "You made me ask you 3 times," he would say, reaching down and picking her up by the collar. "Now, if you don't give me that boy's name, I will make sure your fate is worse than that of Lot's wife. She turned from salvation and turned to salt. You won't even be as useful as that." Elizabeth's breathing grew even heavier as she sat there in silence. "He's my friend," she whimpered, not daring look at him as she was picked up. "I'm sorry." Pastor Payne would pull Elizabeth with him, throwing her into a closet where she couldn't stand, and her shoulders touched the sides. Without another word, the pastor would slam the door and lock it. stealing Elizabeth into an extremely dark room. Elizabeth stumbled and her breath was knocked out of her as she hit the wall of the closet. Her eyes widened as she realized what was happening. "No, Dad, please." But he had already slammed and locked the door. She tried the handle to no avail, crying. Still, she did not say Henry's name for fear of what her father might do. It would be easy to lose track of time in the dark, cramped closet. Had it been a minute or an hour? Was anyone coming back? Would she be left there for the rest of the day? She wouldn't know. Elizabeth tried to catch her breath. After what felt like forever with no one coming back, she began to panic. She banged on the door, shouting for her father. "Please, please, I can't breathe." Her bangs would echo on the door as she pounded, but there was no reply. No one was there, and no one was coming. The young woman curled in on herself, still unable to catch her breath until she finally passed out. It would be hours before anyone entered the office. Pastor Payne made sure of that. He had to make sure those loyal to God had heard the sermon he had prepared, the subject being on God's truth. Once it was over, he asked Abe if he could take Rob for the day. Him and Delilah would make cookies and spend time together with the young boy. Once it was over, he asked Abe if he could take Rob for the day. Of course, Abe had said yes. How could he refuse such a kind offer? The pastor would take the toddler's hand in his big one and lead him to the office. "Now, Robert," the pastor would say, leading the young boy in, Elizabeth able to hear his voice, "I have something special to show you." Rob toddled into the office. He looked up at the pastor, of course not speaking. His mother was awake by the time they came in, but just barely aware. She was aware enough, however, to recognize Rob's cooing and grunting. She covered her mouth and stayed silent. He wouldn't dare show Rob, sweet innocent little Rob, what he'd done to her, would he? The pastor would lead Rob behind his desk, pulling out some new coloring book that colored pages with water. He would hand it to Rob. "Isn't that cool, Robert?" he would say, his voice sweet. "Look at all those lovely pictures. Noah and the animals. And there is Jesus with the little children," he would say, pointing at the pictures. Rob got up really close to them and giggled. Relieved that he was, apparently, not going to let Rob in on what had happened, Elizabeth relaxed slightly. Hearing him interact with Rob, though, made her heart hurt. He had better not hurt that boy, she thought. Not Rob. The pastor would let Rob play with the toy for a bit, letting him feel comfortable. After some time passed, he would then ask, "Robert, do you love your mommy?" Rob looked up upon the word mommy. He grunted in confirmation and tilted his head. Where was mommy? Elizabeth froze. Pastor Payne would nod his head and chuckle, keeping the atmosphere pleasant. "I know mommy loves you very, very much." Rob grunted again and flapped his arms. Elizabeth felt like her heart was breaking more than it had already. "Mommy loves you so much that she is going to do what she needs to keep her soul safe," he would say, still smiling. "You want to be safe, don't you, Robert?" Rob grunted and rubbed his eyes. He was tired. Of course he wanted to be safe. Elizabeth felt a tear drop onto her hand and quickly rubbed away the next one. "Well, Mommy is doing something that makes her soul unsafe, so your daddy and Grandma and I are going to get her some help. And once she's all better, she'll be able to come back and help us keep you safe, too. You understand, Robert?" Rob continued coloring, but grunted in understanding. Of course, he didn't understand exactly what was happening, but he wanted his mommy to get help if she needed it. "Good. Good, Robert," Reuben would say with a nod, then growing quiet as he let the boy color and play, letting the concept sink in Elizabeth's mind that she would not be able to see Rob for a while, that Robert was going to stay with him and be under his control. Elizabeth cried silently, but she was silent, not wanting Rob to hear her sobs. Elizabeth would listen to the pastor and Rob play for a while, then everything would grow silent. Had they left, or were they still in the room but not speaking? Elizabeth didn't make a sound, afraid they hadn't left, and eventually cried herself to sleep quietly. Pastor Payne would wait for 2 full days before returning to his office. He would pull out a key and open the closet door. In his other hand was a bottle of water and an apple. He would stand there, looking down at Elizabeth. Elizabeth had peed herself and thought she was practically starving by the time he came back. She winced at the sudden light and stared at the ground. She didn't think she had it in her, but she began to cry again. But no tears came. "I want his full name, Elizabeth," he said firmly. "Jackson." She gasped out between sobs, quiet. The pastor would look down at her, elongating the anticipation of what he would do next. She winced and braced herself, waiting for him to hit her, but the pastor would not hit her. He would place the water and the apple in the small closet before closing it again, locking the door. Elizabeth shook. Wait, but I told you. I want his full name, Elizabeth, Pastor Payne would say through the door. Not half. Henry Jackson, please, let me out. There would be silence. No noise or answer. Then the door would open, the pastor looking down at Elizabeth. Behold, we consider those blessed who remained steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. James 5:11, he would say, a smile creeping on his face. Elizabeth looked up at him, a look of relief crossing her own before sobs. The pastor would kneel down, wrapping his big arms around Lizzie in a hug. I won't let him hurt you any more, Elizabeth, he would say softly. You're safe now. Lizzie just kept crying, but she did press into him a little bit. How long had it been since she'd had human contact? Too long. Chapter 2. Rob Byrne. Rob was 10 years old and already growing tired of life. His mom had left when he was very young, and his dad was verbally horrible, though at this point he always just assumed that was how all dads were. He didn't get much interaction with other kids, since they all normally thought he was weird. A lot of the adults thought he was weird, too. To be fair, he kind of was. Rob didn't know it, but that day was special. His uncle Elijah was returning from the meeting with the elders of the church. That day they had spoken about their psionic problem within their community, and what was needed to be done. Late in the night, Elijah would walk up to Abe's door and knock on it. Abraham walked up to the door silently and opened it. His brow furrowed in confusion. Elijah? Is everything all right? No, Elijah would state plainly, sighing as he did. I need to come in. Abe stepped aside. Of course, come in. What's so important that you need to show up so late? Elijah would step inside, waiting for Abe to close the door before speaking. The elders made a decision on the children with powers. And what decision was that? Elijah was silent for a moment. Due to factors that I will not name, he would say, though it was clear he meant Gideon. Any children who display abilities will be brought to the main temple to be examined to see if they were blessed by God or an agent of Satan. Abraham would nod. I see. Okay, is this all you wanted to tell me? No, Elijah would say, turning to Abe. I need to know the last thing Rob saw. He would press his lips together. If you want me to be honest, the last thing he told me was that he had another nightmare. Red skies again. I don't remember all the details, though. I'll speak to him then, Elijah would say, then walking straight into Rob's room. He's asleep, Abe would call out, but the man didn't seem to listen. Rob was, indeed, sleeping in his bed. Elijah would shut the door behind him so that Abe wouldn't enter. He walked over to the bed, looking at the sleeping boy for a moment. He would then reach down to the boy's shoulders, lightly shaking him awake. Rob, you need to wake up. The 10-year-old rubbed his eyes with a, 5 more minutes, Dad. But when he saw that it was, in fact, not his father, confusion was written on his face. Uncle? Stand up, Elijah would say, pulling Rob out of the bed and to his feet. He would tower over the child, not finding any need to get on his level. You have to tell me what you saw, Rob. Rob's heart beat a little faster, though he was still confused. What? When? The last thing God showed you, Rob. The last vision you saw. Tell me now, he would say, a cold expression on his face. I don't remember. Elijah would tighten his grip on Rob's shoulders. Now, Rob, you know that God hates those who lie. The Lord detests lying lips, Proverbs 12:22. You don't want to upset God, do you? I'm just tired. Rob tried to pull away a bit and loosen the man's grip. I think it was that one about, Elijah's grip would tighten. So you do remember. Tell me now, Rob, and your punishment for lying will lessen. he would say before saying, "For all that is secret will eventually be brought into the open, and everything that is concealed will be brought into light and made known to all." Luke 8:17. Rob's eyes would start to water. I remember one with like a bright light and a voice that was like, "Stand up." I don't remember when that was, though, he added quickly. And I don't know if it was a prophecy. Elijah would grow quiet as Rob spoke. A bright light? You saw a bright light and didn't tell either your father or me? He would say, gripping harder on Rob. Do you think this is a game, boy? You are receiving the words of the Lord, and you ignore it. Rob tried desperately to pull his arms from the man's grip, eyes widening in fear. I'm sorry. I didn't think it was important. What? Elijah would say, angry. I have never met a more stupid child than you. If it wasn't for your gift, he would stop his words, clearing his throat. Without another word, he would pull Rob out of his room and to his father. Brother Abraham, your son has sinned, he would say, letting go of Rob. You must bring him to the church tomorrow for correction. Abe's brow creased at Rob, and the boy's face crumpled as he looked down. What exactly was it he did? Abe would ask, not in an accusing tone, but in a confused one. He has broken the 10th commandment. Thou shalt not lie, Elijah would say, not looking down at Rob, but at Abe. Luke 8:17 tells us that for all that is secret will eventually be brought into the open, and everything that is concealed will be brought into light and made known to all. He must be brought to the house of the Lord and brought to confess his sin. Abraham was silent for a minute. Then, very well. Will we see you in the morning? Elijah would nod, glancing down at Rob before saying, May God bless you all. He would then turn to leave. Abraham would stop him one more time. What did he lie about this time? He lied about his visions, Elijah would say plainly. He first said he had none. Then he said he saw a golden light that told him to stand up. He clearly saw God and lied about it. Shock was the first emotion to show on Abraham's face, then anger as he looked toward his son. Rob wanted to protest. He hadn't said he didn't have any visions. He said he couldn't remember his last one, which was the truth. But he stayed frozen in fear, mouth clamped shut. Go to bed, his father said suddenly. We'll discuss this in the morning. Rob didn't move. Go to bed. Still, he couldn't move. Stupid boy! Then his father started hurrying toward him. Rob backed up and almost tripped, but ran into his room, hurrying to close the door behind him. In the morning, Elijah would be waiting at the church building for Rob and Abe to come. Rob stared at the ground and dragged his feet as they neared the church. Outside of the church would be Elijah's wife, Mary. She would be changing the lettering on the information boards. Seeing Abe and Rob, she would flash a smile at them. Hello, Brother Abe. Rob, how are you two this blessed morning? We're doing well, thank you, Abe would say. Rob just continued to stare at the ground. Mary's eyes would flick to Rob, her plastered smile not faltering. Are you looking for Pastor Payne? She would ask. Rob rubbed his arm where he had been grabbed the night before, and a bit of a bruise could be seen peeking out of his shirt sleeve. Abe would nudge him when he didn't speak. Rob nodded. Yeah. He's right inside. You can go in, Rob. Your father and I have something we need to talk about out here, she would say, her smile still the same. Rob looked up at his father, who looked just as confused, but not as concerned as Rob. The boy bit the inside of his cheek as he walked into the church. Walking into the church, the building was large and newly built. There were rumors that the last building had been destroyed by a demon, and the lands had to be purified. Elijah stood near the back, looking up at a large cross on the ceiling with Jesus depicted hanging from it. Rob would look around the church. Every time he went in there, something new could be found in the detailing. He gulped as he watched Elijah, standing frozen in fear. Elijah would turn, looking at Rob. Rob, come, he would say with a gesture of his hand. Rob just stood there. Move, Rob, what are you doing? He couldn't feel his legs, but they moved just fine as he walked over to Elijah. Elijah would reach out and take Rob's hand, looking back up at the Jesus statue. What do you see, Rob? He would ask. Jesus? Was this a trick question? Rob blinked, clearly confused as to why the man was asking him such a question. And what did Jesus do? Elijah would ask, not looking down at Rob. He died for our sins? Rob was still scared, if he was honest, but confused now more than ever. Yes, Rob. And do you think he wants you to add to the pain of his death with more sins? Rob felt his heart hurt. He looked down and shook his head. What does Psalm 56, 3-4 say? Elijah would ask, now turning to look down at Rob. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you. In God I have put my trust. No, Elijah would say, stopping Rob from talking. It says, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? Are you afraid, Rob? Rob sighed shakily, staring at the ground. Don't lie, Rob. God will hate your guts if you lie. A little. It will be all right, my child. I am going to help correct you and put you on the right path, Elijah said, pulling Rob by the hand to the side door. There would be a series of trees there. Pick a branch. Huh? Rob was confused now, and he wasn't hiding it. Pick a branch, Elijah would repeat. And if you don't pick a good one, I will pick the biggest one I can find. Rob gulped and grabbed a medium-sized stick. Elijah would nod in approval. To my office, then, he would say, opening the door for Rob to lead. Rob took the stick with him. His face crumpled, but he quickly fixed it, not wanting to get into any more trouble. Elijah would follow behind Rob to his office, his footsteps heavy as he walked behind the small boy. Once they were inside, Elijah would shut the door, locking it behind him. You know we do this because we love you, Rob. We're trying to make sure you grow up correctly, as God wanted you to grow up. The boy would hug himself. He was shaking, but he tried not to make it noticeable. He was cold, probably from nerves, and nauseous, definitely from nerves. He stood there, frozen. I'm sorry, he croaked out. I won't lie anymore, or I'll try not to. His breath was shaky and his knees weak. Please, don't hurt me. Rob, you broke a commandment of God, Elijah would say, looking down at the boy. You cannot keep the visions of God away from me by lying. I didn't mean to, Rob whimpered. He was crying now. I'm really sorry. Tell me what you saw then. The full truth, Elijah would say coldly. I saw a light. Rob decided to stick with the same dream. It was really bright. Someone said, stand up. Then, he was still crying, hugging himself. Then the light went away, and I saw a woman, and she pointed at me, and I looked up, and the sky was red, and then it was really loud, and I woke up. Elijah would frown, his lips becoming a thin line. What did the woman look like? Rob shrugged and shook his head. Just like a white lady? I remember she looked average. I think her hair was brown. Are you leaving anything else? Elijah would say, taking a step forward to Rob. Rob thought back for a minute, trying hard to remember. I remember she didn't have any tattoos or anything. She was very, plain. Elijah would cross his arm, tapping them softly, as he looked down at Rob, an unconvinced look. I really don't remember anything else, Rob said honestly. Maybe I will later, but I don't. It might not even be a vision. I'm just stupid. I don't know. I can't really tell them apart. I'm not trying to lie, I promise, or I'm just confused. Yes, you are confused, Elijah would say. So let me clarify something. You have to remember what you see. If you do not, he would say, gesturing to the branch. Rob's face crumpled in fear. I don't think I have any control over that part. Elijah would say, holding up a finger and wiggling it. Don't say that. Besides this, you know the time, that the hour has come for you to wake from sleep. For salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. Romans 13:11. Rob winced. Huh? But what if the world's not ending? Sir, what if they're just dreams? I'm scared. You won't have to be afraid, Rob. You need to trust me. God has a plan for all of us. You are like Daniel. God spoke to him through dreams as he is doing to you now. Okay, he said, his voice still hoarse from crying. He looked down and eyed the ground. Good, Elijah would say with a nod. Now stop crying and you can go back to your father. Rob nodded and let out a little breath as sudden relief washed over him. He started to walk towards the door. Elijah would silently stop him, reaching to pluck the branch from Rob's hand, then watched him go on his way. Rob would wince, afraid he was going to get hit for a second, but when he didn't, he was on his way. He made his way back to his father silently. Mary would still be chatting away with Abe, her fake smile plastered on her face. She would turn to see Rob. "Hello, Rob. Was your time with the pastor helpful?" Rob was silent for a minute before he just said, "Yes." "Good," she would say, reaching over and giving Rob's shoulder a squeeze. "May both of you have blessings and bring more lambs to the fold." Rob would nod, still staring at the ground. Mary smiled, looking back to Abe and giving him a small wave. "We'll see you later, Mary." Abe would nod to her and take Rob by the shoulder. You have just finished The Sidekick, Episode 5. Thanks for watching!